Here's something that hit differently in 2025. Ron Howard, America's eternal nice guy, the man who spent his childhood as Opie Taylor and his teenage years as Richie Cunningham, earned his very first acting Emmy nomination. Not for a heartwarming drama. Not for a prestige biopic. For playing a screaming, tantrum-throwing version of himself on Apple TV Plus's Hollywood satire The Studio, where he gets into a full-blown physical scuffle with Seth Rogen's fictional studio head over a single note on his film. Howard himself joked on Instagram after the nomination dropped, "I'm laughing because I've been in the television business since 1959 and this is the first time I've been nominated for acting. Opie's not worthy? Richie's chopped liver?" The crowd loved it. But here's what made that moment electric: it wasn't just a bit. It was 60-plus years of suppressed knowledge leaking out in a single comedic eruption. Because Ron Howard, the man who built his reputation on patience and collaboration, has spent his entire career surrounded by some of the most difficult personalities the industry ever produced. He survived them all. And in doing so, he quietly learned everything about what it means to lead. These are the 6 actors who tested him most, and what each one ultimately cost him, and taught him. Frances Bavier, the mask of the matriarch. To the millions of Americans who tuned into the Andy Griffith Show throughout the 60s, Frances Bavier was the soul of domestic warmth. As Aunt Bee, she was Mayberry's beating heart, the woman who worried about her pickles, fussed over Opie, and radiated a love so reliable it felt architectural. For the young Ron Howard, the reality of working with Bavier was something else entirely, his first masterclass in the jarring distance between a public persona and a private one. Bavier was a classically trained New York stage actress who never made peace with what she had become. She didn't see herself as part of a gentle rural comedy, she saw herself as a serious dramatic artist trapped in a medium she quietly resented. That resentment created a particular kind of friction, not loud or explosive, but cold and constant. Howard has recalled in interviews and in his memoir The Boys that Bavier was not a fan of the hijinks Andy Griffith and Don Knotts were so famous for. While the men laughed and ad-libbed between takes, Bavier remained rigid. She once reportedly took a swing at actor Jim Nabors with an umbrella because his singing grated on her nerves. Not exactly the behavior you'd expect from America's favorite television aunt. For a child actor like Howard, who looked to the adults on set for cues on how to behave, Bavier was a confusing presence. He had to perform intimacy with a woman who offered him nothing but polite distance, or visible annoyance. What he learned in that tension was something no acting class could teach, that chemistry is often an act of pure will. That the warmth you see on screen is sometimes built on a foundation of professional frost. Bavier eventually retired to North Carolina, becoming a recluse who rejected most reunion invitations. Howard has spoken of her with a mixture of pity and genuine respect ever since. She was his first encounter with the Golden Age ghost, the actor haunted by the role she felt she should have played. She was the one who taught him that a family on screen is often just a collection of strangers honoring a contract. Yul Brynner, the tyranny of the icon. If Bavier was a cold breeze in a small town, Yul Brynner was a hurricane in a silk robe. Howard encountered him on the set of the 1959 film The Journey. Howard was 5 years old. Brynner was already a god, shaved head, booming voice, carrying the magnetic authority of a man who had played king so many times he had stopped distinguishing between performance and identity. He didn't make room for a child. He didn't make room for anyone who wasn't reflected in his own mythology. Brynner moved through the production with the rigid, terrifying grace of someone who had been treated as a sovereign by an entire studio system, and had accepted that treatment as his natural right. Howard recalls being genuinely frightened by him. Brynner had a way of looking through people rather than at them, a technique designed to preserve his status as the most important presence in any room. Adult crew members, seasoned professionals with dozens of films behind them, scrambled to appease his every requirement. For Howard, this was a foundational lesson in how a single ego can hijack a collective creative process. Brynner's model was built on subordination, everyone else's comfort, confidence, and creative energy was conscripted into the project of maintaining his aura. Decades later, Howard's sets would become famous for being exactly the opposite: relaxed, collaborative, egalitarian. That isn't an accident. The ghost of Yul Brynner almost certainly sat on his shoulder during those early directing years as a reminder of what not to be. Fear can produce a powerful performance. It also produces a brittle environment where nobody dares to innovate. Brynner showed Howard that the icon is often a cage, not just for the people working around them, but for the actor themselves, who must spend every waking moment performing their own greatness. Shelley Long, The Perfectionist's Purgatory. By 1982, Howard was no longer the child actor under the thumb of Golden Age titans. He was a young director on night shift, trying to prove he had the authority to lead a major feature film. In Shelley Long, he found a brilliant comedienne, and an analytical anchor whose process was so meticulous in questioning that it threatened, on more than one occasion, to grind the production to a halt. Long came from Chicago's Second City tradition, where intellectual deconstruction and character motivation were treated as sacred obligations. While Michael Keaton improvised at a mile a minute and Henry Winkler leaned into his natural warmth, Long was often the brakes on the set. She didn't just want to say the lines. She wanted to understand the molecular structure of why her character would choose those specific words. Industry lore from that era consistently describes an actress who was not always the easiest to get along with, not because she was a diva in the traditional sense, but because she was a perfectionist who could be genuinely oblivious to what the ensemble needed from her. On night shift, this manifested as endless questions and persistent requests for one more take long after Howard was satisfied. Howard had to learn a crucial lesson in directorial psychology: the perfectionist isn't trying to be difficult. They are trying to be safe. For Long, obsessive scrutiny was a shield against failure. But a director cannot let a shield become a wall. He found himself negotiating a daily peace treaty between the schedule and a star's need for certainty. He realized that being a nice guy wasn't sufficient. He had to become a clear guy, one who could set firm limits without dismissing an actor's legitimate concerns. Long is undeniably brilliant in Night Shift, bringing a vulnerability to the role that another actress might never have found. Howard learned to appreciate the result even when the journey was grueling. But the lesson embedded itself permanently: the most difficult part of directing isn't the lighting or the script. It's the human ego, disguised as the work. Russell Crowe, The Volatile Alchemist. If Long's friction was a slow-motion intellectual grind, Russell Crowe was a lightning strike. By the time Howard cast him in A Beautiful Mind, Crowe was already a legend of the mercurial variety, a man whose physical intensity and hair-trigger temperament were as famous as his Oscar-caliber talent. Howard, the perennial builder of collaborative environments, was now tasked with directing a performer who believed that great art could only be forged in a high-pressure furnace. Crowe didn't just play John Nash, he occupied him. And he expected the production to bend to the needs of that occupation. Howard has described how Crowe would ask good, hard questions, a director's diplomatic shorthand for intense, multi-hour debates about a single line of dialogue or the placement of a prop. Crowe was known during this era for a genuine short fuse, and that combustibility followed him onto the soundstage. Managing him meant walking a constant tightrope between providing enough space for his genius to breathe and preventing it from consuming the crew. The most telling example came when Crowe insisted on shooting A Beautiful Mind in chronological order, a logistical nightmare for a production operating on a tight budget. Howard initially pushed back. But Crowe was relentless, arguing that the psychological deterioration of John Nash couldn't be convincingly faked by jumping around the timeline. In a rare and revealing pivot, Howard agreed. He recognized that Crowe wasn't being difficult for ego's sake. He was being difficult for the sake of the truth. That distinction changed everything between them. Howard learned that with A Volatile Alchemist, you don't fight the fire, you channel it. The psychological toll was real. Unlike his sets with Tom Hanks or Steve Martin, the Crowe productions were heavy with the work, days of silence, days of heated debate, days where the atmosphere was thick with dissatisfaction. But when A Beautiful Mind won Best Picture at the Academy Awards, Howard understood something essential: conflict isn't always something to be managed away. Sometimes it is exactly the fuel a masterpiece requires. Tom Sizemore, The Lost Highway. Russell Crowe represented the fire of genius. Tom Sizemore represented something far more heartbreaking, the slow-motion collapse of reliability. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Sizemore was one of the most sought-after tough guys in the business, a powerhouse who could hold his own against De Niro and Hanks. But the version of Sizemore that Howard encountered, across the broader industry circles he navigated during that era, was a man being consumed by severe addiction. Howard's sets are built on a specific foundation: show up early, know your lines, and respect the crew. An actor in the grip of addiction lives in direct opposition to every one of those values. The challenge Sizemore posed wasn't the defiance of an ego or the obsession of a perfectionist. It was the total abandonment of the professional contract. Every day he appeared on a call sheet, the director's first question wasn't whether the scene would be great. It was whether the actor would arrive at all. For Howard, whose entire operating philosophy is built on protecting the collective creative effort, this was a particularly difficult lesson to absorb. He realized that kindness has limits that matter, that you cannot support someone out of a crisis that exists entirely outside your reach. He had to understand the difference between being a mentor and being a guardian of the production, and he learned that those two roles sometimes point in opposite directions. Sizemore became Howard's heartbreak pillar, a reminder that immense talent is not a shield against self-destruction, and that the most painful kind of friction isn't with an actor who fights you. It's with one who isn't fully there to fight at all. Sizemore passed away in 2023, and that loss only sharpened the weight of what Howard had witnessed. Henry Winkler, the paradox of the sidekick. The most complex friction in Ron Howard's career didn't come from an adversary. It came from his best friend. On Happy Days, Howard was the undisputed lead, Richie Cunningham, the moral compass, the boy the whole show was built around. Then, within a few seasons, something unprecedented happened. Henry Winkler's Fonzie didn't just become popular. He became a cultural phenomenon. He became, for millions of Americans, the actual reason to tune in. The industry noticed immediately. Network executives who had treated Howard with professional warmth began speaking to him with a disrespect that stung. They floated a plan to rename the show Fonzie's Happy Days, an insult so pointed that Howard threatened to walk. He wasn't jealous of Winkler, whom he loved then and loves now. Winkler is godfather to Howard's children, a bond still celebrated today on their shared social media. What Howard was protecting was something different, his own professional dignity. The lesson was about the speed of Hollywood's loyalty, how quickly an industry will discard a reliable workhorse the moment a flashier thoroughbred appears on the track. Howard handled it with a maturity Winkler himself calls beyond his years. He kept his head down, kept working, and quietly redirected his ambitions. If the network wasn't going to respect him as an actor, he would become the person who hired the actors. He would direct. Years later, the two discussed this period openly on a podcast, and Howard confessed quietly, "It did hurt my feelings." It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who guards his emotions carefully. And yet it was also the most instructive moment of his entire career. The erasure of his leading man status on Happy Days was the precise mechanism that launched one of the greatest directorial careers in Hollywood history. Winkler didn't just give Richie Cunningham a rival. He gave Ron Howard a reason to build an empire. Ron Howard's journey through 6 decades of Hollywood wasn't a walk through a garden. It was a navigation through a minefield populated by cold professionals, self-appointed kings, analytical obstructionists, volatile geniuses, tragic casualties, and beloved rivals. And yet none of them broke him. He converted every collision into a lesson, every difficulty into a directorial instinct. It's fitting, then, that in 2025, the same year the studio earned 23 Emmy nominations and became the most talked about Hollywood satire in decades, Ron Howard earned his first ever acting nomination for playing a version of himself who loses his temper in a studio meeting. The industry laughed. But what they were really watching was 60 years of accumulated wisdom about ego, patience, and the hidden cost of genius, compressed into a single comedic outburst. The nice guy always knew exactly what was happening behind the curtain. He just waited until the right moment to show it. Subscribe to keep uncovering the truth behind the legends. Thanks for watching.